Welcome to the Innovation Storytellers podcast. We talk to innovators and disruptors in R&D, product managers, intrapreneurs, and entrepreneurs, innovation thought leaders, and their storytellers who help bring their amazing ideas to life. Now, here's your host, Innovation Storyteller, CEO, speaker, and coach to the world's top innovation teams, Susan Lindner.
Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Lindner. I'm your host of Innovation Storytellers. And for the last 20 years, I've been helping innovators and disruptors to tell their stories. 10 acquisitions, hundreds of interactive products, and countless hockey stick growth curves, and some in both directions, and experiences with new categories along the way. I wanted to share how great innovations get to market using stories to pave the way. And on this season, which we're calling Outside In, we're talking to some of the top consultants in the innovation space on how they work with their clients to actually help move the innovation process forward. And I'm really excited for our guest today because not only are we talking about that outside perspective coming into a client, but we're also talking about the technology that underlies some of the innovation processes. Now, many of us think about product managers and innovation leaders as kind of having this great portfolio of innovations, but not necessarily the tools that we use to move innovation through a large corporation. And that's critical, all the way from ideation, all the way through to scale and getting product to market. And so I want to welcome my guest. Tendayi, if you could please do the brilliant introduction for yourself, because your background is so varied, both with large companies on the outside as a consultant and also as a technology player here. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into the innovation space.
Thank you for having me. It's real great fun to be having a conversation with you. So I'm Tendayi Viki, if you know. I'm associate partner at Strategyzer, where I work with Alex Osterwalder and a really fantastic team over there. And we're trying to build the software platform that drives the right behaviors around innovation, product design, testing ideas with the customers, tracking data and metrics, and just making sure that teams are doing the right things at the right time. So, I come at this from an academic background. I'm a former academic. I used to teach organizational behavior at the University of Kent in the UK. And then I transitioned to working with startups a little while. And then I got brought into working with corporates in terms of helping them kind of, define their innovation processes. And so in doing that, and just sort of a bit of pattern recognition here and there, I kind of wrote 3 books: The Corporate Startup, The Lean Product Lifecycle, and my latest book, Pirates in the Navy. And so all of this work is what has kind of led me for the last couple of years to then be collaborating with Alex Osterwalder and doing the work we're doing as Strategyzer.
Kind of wrote a couple of little books. Yeah, like understatement of the year, right? Because so many of us in the innovation space have looked to this kind of information in order to move innovation forward. And probably better than anyone else, it is not easy to move giant companies to get off their quarterly P&L, to get past the hammering away of meeting corporate profits and meeting corporate goals, to actually dive into the innovation space. But it's always been your conjecture that innovation must be part and parcel of the work of great companies. Otherwise, you're pretty quick to fall off the S&P 500, right, for us here in the United States. So what's the process? When you look at this in the 3 phases, there's people, there's process, there's technology. If we could do it all over again, if we could wave the magic wand and start from the get-go, where would one want to start with these 3 layers: the people, the processes, the technology? If you would walk into a new corporation today, what would you do first?
I would start with process first, because you have to first define the philosophy of what you want to do. What does it look like when it's done well? Once you then get a consistent agreement of what things look like when they're done well, you can then start thinking, okay, well, how do we instantiate that in technology? And how do we then get our people the skills, support, and training they need in order to start doing this work well? And so what tends to happen is, like, I've been in organizations that kind of jump on fads. Oh, we saw a platform where people can, put ideas and people vote. It's like, okay, cool. Like, okay, do it. But the ultimate goal is not to gather ideas and let people vote on ideas, right? The ultimate goal is to make sure that somehow those ideas become value propositions that resonate with customers. Somehow those value propositions get embedded in really great business models that are profitable and scalable. And then all of that goes out to the world. And so that's the process you want, really. You don't want a platform for submitting ideas and voting on them. So the first thing we want you to focus on is really think about the process. How and what is the best way, the most world-class way to manage innovation? Once you've got that down, then you can start thinking about the other two elements.
Yeah. And so that process is always tying into the larger corporate strategy, right? As opposed to having innovation be in its own little corner of the universe within a company. I mean, I've certainly seen it done both ways. There are great fears among some large companies that innovation gets cannibalized when it's allowed to live among the quarterly P&L folk.
Yeah. So again, the question is not really about the quarterly P&L folk. It's about what the quarterly P&L folk are doing when they're trying to make decisions about innovation. That's really where the controversy is. So people often ask me, this question of like, why is it that established organizations, large companies struggle with innovation? There's only one big reason. Like, all the other reasons tumble from that one reason. And that one reason is that they want to take whatever process they're using for running their company right now and apply it to exploring new ideas. So then everything starts to break because you've got 5-year roadmaps, 3-year ROI return expectations, all of the toolboxes that are used to drive the current P&L. Once you take those and apply those to new ideas, you put those ideas under pressure to prove things that they don't have yet in terms of data. And so the more and more you do that, the more and more teams start to recognize that it's better to just keep doing things we've always done, because that's the safest space with the tools that we're using to manage them. And so when you make the distinction between exploring new ideas and exploiting current success, you then have to make this distinction that managing these two things has to be different. So what are the things that have to be different when you're managing these two arenas? Well, the first thing is the best way to find good ideas when you're working in innovation is to have loads of ideas. So this idea that we have when we're running the core P&L that we should always know exactly what's going to happen, pick the right things, make the right decisions, that works because you're dealing with existing customers, existing products, and complaints that you hear every day. When you start exploring something new, that raises a lot of unknowns. And so it's hard to pick the winning idea on day one. So that's the first philosophy that we have leaders embrace. But yeah, when you make the distinction between these two things, you cannot pick the winning idea on day one when it comes to innovation. So the only way you can do it is to invest in multiple ideas, make multiple small bets, and then allow those teams time and space to test and validate those bets, and anticipate that over half the bets you make are not going to turn out to be anything useful. But you just keep a process of tracking how they're working, and then you make decisions later about which of those bets you're going to scale. So that's already a philosophy that you have to embrace in terms of distinction in process.
And you must do it throughout and consistently, right? It's not that you can give up halfway and said, wow, we've now experienced these 8 out of 10 failures. I guess we should just throw in the towel. This is the fear that lives in the heart of the CEO who has to go back to the board and say, we put 10 million in bets and we've lost 8.
Yeah, well, they shouldn't be saying that.
Right.
So we're saying make multiple small bets. So if you're saying you put 8 million in bets, you put 10 million in bets and you lost 8, you already invested too much. So the best way to drive an innovation portfolio is to make small bets. So here's the thing, right? So let's say, okay, we've invested in 20 ideas. We want to know which of those ideas have legs. What do you need to do to find out if an idea has legs? Well, it's really like 2 main questions you need to sort of answer. The first question is, which customer and what problems are we solving? And would those customers pay to have that problem solved? That's what you need to discover.
Fundamental.
Exactly. Really fundamental for all 20 ideas. You can do that without ever building a single thing. So you don't need to invest $10 million to discover that. In just doing that, it might cost you a couple of $100,000. In just doing that work, you could probably get rid of half of those ideas. And then the next question is, okay, what is the solution to those problems and what does that look like? And do we have the capability to create that solution? You could start building prototypes and testing those prototypes with customers for a little more investment than at the first stage. But now you're investing in fewer ideas because you filtered out the ideas that didn't have legs. And then the next question becomes, Will the customers pay? How much will they pay? Is that more than what it costs us to create the value proposition? Ooh, okay, half these ideas don't really work, so let's only focus on these ideas. So by the time you get to spend $1 million, you're making that bet on something that's a relatively sure shot. It's not definitively a sure shot, but it's more, you know more about that than you did at the beginning. And it is at that point that you can then say, okay, let's make a bigger bet. Let's now use business case and roadmap and all this, because we've learned enough for us to kind of, build something valuable.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean when I say understand the philosophy and process before you build the technology. Because if you then want to pick up a technology, it has to be an instantiation of that thing I just described. If you want to teach and train people in leadership, you have to teach them those practices, right? So it's really important to learn that first and figure that out and master that first.
Yeah. Tendayi, you were working at a huge company like Pearson and directing an award-winning innovation program there and getting deep into when you're on the inside, right, of a company, as you were for 5 years doing that work, 30,000 employees around the world. Is the ability to communicate around this innovation process and this innovation plan challenging to kind of get so many feet moving in the same direction? Or is it your idea that innovation takes place within these small bets, within small teams, with small communications as well, to get those people rallied and excited behind you and then expand the communication over time? Or do you feel that to create a real innovation culture, we should all be aware of the great innovation that's going on in our company, even if it's taking place in a corner of the company?
Right. So interesting question. And I learned a lot in those 5 years at Pearson, right? Mm-hmm. Special shout out to Sonia Krusevich, who was Senior Vice President, who was leading that program when I was working there as director. And also my colleague, Craig Strong, who we wrote the book together with the Lean Product Lifecycle.
Sonia was just on our program last week.
Right. Yeah. And so the first thing we learned was this: you don't want to have a PowerPoint. So storytelling is awful when you have a PowerPoint presentation and you're walking around the organization and you're talking about what's happening at other companies. So when we began, we're like, we know this our innovation is supposed to work. You're supposed to make small bets. You're supposed to use a lean product life cycle with ideation, exploration, validation before you scale. You're supposed to do these things. And they were like, well, how do you know it works? And we're like, well, you can see that at Google they do this, and at Amazon. And you're like, well, we're not Google and we're not Amazon. So the first lesson we learned, we were lucky to have jobs 5 years because we kept making these mistakes. So the first lesson we learned was that it's impossible to get the whole organization moving in one direction with 30,000 people if your story is about what's happening in external companies. So every innovator now, and that's the process that I describe in Pearson, the Navy, every innovation team that I work with, I often encourage them to get an early win. Get an early win inside the company that you're working for. So the only way to get an early win is to identify early adopter teams and leaders who are already trying stuff around innovation, work with them, drive that to success, and then leverage those stories and tell those stories to the organization. Why do those kinds of stories matter? Because the only time the storytelling is powerful is when there's a relatable hero.
Right.
And there's nothing more relatable than when the story is about a team from inside this organization that has used this process and become a success. So in Pirates in the Navy, I say, get an early win, then celebrate like crazy in public. Because once you do that, you create gravity towards your movement, right? Now you're not a used car salesman or a double glazing window sales guy who calls people while they're trying to have their dinner and goes, hey, guess what? I'm selling innovation. Now you're telling stories that are really interesting. You don't even put yourself and your team front and center. You put those successful innovators front and center. Allow them to tell the stories. And as people relate to those stories, they're like, oh, I want to be part of that. How do I get involved? And as people become more and more involved, you start to build that momentum for a nice innovation movement. And so that's what I've learned works. And so now I keep trying to do that every time I'm working with a company.
Yeah. And what about those stories of failure?
Yes. So the stories of failure are useful only in the context of at least an example of a win. Because you have to be able to say a successful innovation ecosystem works in this way. The story has to be, you have to fail to get a success, right? And so we failed, and then we got this success. We failed, until we got success. So people have to feel that failing eventually leads to success. If they don't have that feeling where we're just telling failure stories, it's not really that inspiring. And so as much as we want to celebrate failure in innovation is always in service of success.
Right. Nobody budgets for failure, right? We know it's going to be part and parcel of the process, but it's certainly a learning process along the way.
We do budget for failure, but we only budget for failure as a portfolio investment in future success.
Yeah. And what about the learnings that come from that failure? Because so many of our listeners know they have this kind of 80-20 rule, the same with their innovation portfolio, recognizing that we hope it's smaller than 80-20 success rate, meaning 20% succeed. But there's the quantifying failure and the value of failure along the way. And many of my guests have talked about, we recognized in 6 weeks as opposed to, 18 months that this product wouldn't work, and we shelved it. And here's what we learned, and here's how we applied learning into the next product or into the next group within the portfolio. Is part of the storytelling also about quantifying the value of the failure?
Yeah, part of the storytelling is quantifying the value of failure to the extent that that failure produced useful learnings that would then apply to other things. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, right, Fred Wilson, really famous venture capitalist, Union Square Ventures, right? He will say that he works with a 1/3 rule, which is that 1/3 of his investments will fail, 1/3 will be mediocre, but 1/3 will bring returns. That's a full story. If we only talk about the 1/3 that fail, we've only told half the story. And the story is uninteresting. The relatable hero is relatable in the sense that they stumble at the beginning, they have to work through some issues, they cry, they climb up the mountain, then they slip down, then they figure out that the best way to climb the mountain is this way, and then they get to the mountaintop. That's a complete story. Like when you tie all those things together, you're telling a full story that's motivating. If the story is that, innovation is about falling down the mountain all the time, then it's like, okay, you enjoy that? We're going to do this thing where we're always on the top of the mountain. And so that's why for me, the best stories are the ones where failure is mixed together with early wins. And that's why we often say, especially when we're working with those early adopters, don't give us one project. Alex Osterwalder, who I work with, has got this really nice phrase where he says, if you have one project, that project is condemned to succeed. And so once an innovation project is condemned to succeed, they won't learn from any of the lessons that they're learning from running experiments. They won't even admit to the failure. They'll just keep doing things that appear like success. But if you have a portfolio of projects, not any one project is condemned to succeed. We're measuring the success of the overall. And that's when you can start to share lessons and all of those things while you're working together like that.
We had a great conversation with the Chief Innovation Officer at Corning Glass here, who was telling us about one of the most successful failures of 1930 in their innovation lab. Right. And, this is the glory of having a 169-year-old company, is that all of those failures are categorized and archived. And they are pulling out that ahead of its time technology that arrived in 1930, and they're using it 90 years later for an innovation now. And so, oftentimes we hear that, it's ahead of its time. All of these innovations, these quote unquote failures, may have an opportunity for success when the cylinders line up correctly, right? So that condemned to failure, but not forever, can be a possibility too.
Yes. And you need places to store those stories and those lessons.
Yeah.
So if they're saying that something failed in 1930 and then they ended up finding a use for it in the 90s, it means that it was sitting somewhere.
In 2020.
And if you really listen to the stories that they're telling, the success they finally got would not have been the first time somebody tried to do something with that over the 60, 70 years that they were waiting. And so there was probably like 10 other instances where other people said, that's interesting, let me try it. And then it didn't work to somebody else. And if those lessons mount up, they add up to this one moment. It's like, this is what it's actually going to be useful for. And so I think that's really great. But imagine if everything Corning worked on was like that.
Got put in a shelf, in a box somewhere.
Exactly, right? No, or everything they worked on didn't work out. They wouldn't be a company.
That's right.
So you do need a balance of those things that are working versus those things that are not working. And that's the fullness of your portfolio.
It's interesting. I know, Tendayi, that you have a background in psychology.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm an anthropologist by training, and yet both of us wound up in innovation somehow. And I'm very curious, your background you're from Zimbabwe originally, right? And then you're in the UK, you've worked all over the world. I'm really curious how your background has kind of given you a unique perspective as even a psychologist, and with a different continental perspective on innovation too, if these two things kind of give you an outside edge as a consultant to maybe see things differently. And goodness knows you have to work with my kids' age working in universities, right? God bless you. But with those minds that you shape into clay, and as a psychology major in college, I'm sure you think back to those times going, oof, if I only knew now. But I'm curious, having a different continent's perspective, having a psychology perspective on innovation, what about the human mind maybe, or even a different perspective could companies take away from your experience, knowing what you know that perhaps some of us don't?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because as much as we talked about process just now, right, it's not companies or processes that innovate, right? It's the people.
That's what I was hoping to get to, yes.
Right. So people are the ones that end up doing the work. And so you really need to understand how to inspire people, how to motivate people, the biases that people have, their fear of failure, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs and what that looks like in terms of their professional career.
So that's Wi-Fi, a charging station. What's in the Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Because exactly. I'm pretty sure food, clothing, and shelter is way further down.
If you're an innovation guy, it's Wi-Fi, charge station, and KO juice. So that's what you need in your Maslow. But you do need to understand all of those things that drive behavior. So one of the things that a lot of companies try and do is, for example, I've heard leaders say things like, we need more ideas. Why is it that my people don't give me ideas? And one of my favorite quotes, and I don't know who said this, but it's something about, if a flower fails to bloom, you don't start shouting at the flower going, where are the flowers? Right? You investigate the soil in which it's sitting, and you try and put nutrients in that soil. And so that's the same thing we do with Strategyzer when we're working with companies, is we often ask those companies, what are the cultural enablers and blockers of the behaviors you want? Like what's getting in the way of the behaviors you want to see? And it's often what we reward and celebrate. So one of my favorite saying is, people often treat culture like it's a positive vibe that comes down from the mountain to bless the people. We need more culture.
It's the corporate retreat.
It's the corporate retreat. It's the sticky note, right? Things like that. But it's not really like a culture for me in a society or in a company is determined by what people are embarrassed to do in public.
So we are a collection of, this anthropologist will ask you, we are a collection of taboos, and it's just a question of what taboos we offer to show one another.
Exactly. So we're a collection of taboos. And one taboo inside an organization is your projects never fail. Right? So people are embarrassed to admit failing projects in public because people only get promoted based on their success. So one of the things we've been tinkering with, for example, at Strategyzer, is when you put like a group of teams in an innovation portfolio, you reward the success of the portfolio, not the success of any individual ideas. Because if the principle is correct, the best way to find good ideas is to have loads of ideas, then even those people whose ideas have failed have contributed to that whole mix. And so we recognize the portfolio, especially if failure is honest. People have really tested their ideas and found that there are no legs there. We want them to tell us that, and we want to celebrate that, right? And so building those enablers within organizations will drive the behaviors we want, and then those behaviors will create the outcomes we want. But inside organizations, we tend to focus a lot on the outcomes, and then we don't even know what's driving the behaviors. And we kind of take all our processes as if they came down from the mountain with Moses, ordained to never change. And so we're kind of stuck in this whole cultural process. And so it's really important for us that we build those enablers that drive the right behaviors for innovation to flourish.
So these are some of the psychologically, right, and culturally, these are the things that you look at even when you're bringing a technology platform like Strategyzer into a business.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
Is really getting clean, let's say, is really getting honest and open about what we incentivize and what we punish.
Exactly. So we have a whole process that we do at Strategyzer. We call it the Innovation Ecosystem Assessment. And it's got like a whole bunch of stuff in it. Like we do stuff like, tell us your 10 favorite innovations, right? People write them down on a sticky note. Then we say, okay, let's classify what kinds of innovations those are. Are they just efficiency innovations where you're optimizing your current business? Are they sustaining innovations, or are they like transformative innovations where you're really trying something new? And then people can see visually that they're not really trying anything new. Yeah. So they start to get a sense of what their culture is like. Okay, let's have a conversation about all the innovation programs that you're running, hackathons, idea jams, et cetera, right? Let's map those against a particular dimension. How much value are they creating in terms of new ideas that have actually been launched into the market? How much value are they creating in terms of transforming your culture so you can do innovation as a repeatable process? And then so then they get to see a point of view of what their culture is like. And then finally we go, okay, let's do a deeper dive into your culture and see, do you have the right level of leadership support? Do you have clear strategic guidance? Do you manage a portfolio? Do you make incremental bets? So we have this tool, the Innovation Culture Assessment, and we assess all that. And then people can see visually where they are. And then we're going to start to have a conversation. Because if we start by going, here's the business model canvas, well, it's a cool tool, but we can do the workshop. But if nobody's going to use it after we leave, it doesn't matter. And so we really need to start by addressing all of these cultural issues to make sure that the soil in which we then plant this platform can actually nurture that platform and actually make it work. And we are learning this from having made the first mistake. We were quite excited always to go in and teach lean startup, teach experimentation, teach design thinking. Here's the value proposition canvas. Here's the business model canvas. Everyone is excited. It's a Strategyzer masterclass. And then they go back to their jobs and they can't use any of it. So through like a period of self-reflection, we thought, we need to actually really be thinking about the soil in which we're planting this. So ecosystem design is really a big feature of what we do now.
Okay, so we got the process, we got the people, and then we get to the tech, right? Yeah. And I often tell that to people when they are considering their innovation storytelling is that your hero is Luke Skywalker, not the lightsaber.
Right? Hey, hold on. There was somebody holding that lightsaber?
That's right. That's somebody, exactly. So many, and I spend most of my time in tech, so many folks get so carried away with the brilliant line of code and that incredible new product, and they forget that it's actually humans who are operating that. And the story that we tell is, yes, an incredible tech breakthrough, and look what it's capable of doing. But it means nothing unless we spell out this, and here's how it makes your life better. Here's how your future will be better once the tech and you, the hero, are in it to win it together.
Yeah.
And so how do you stop companies from falling in love with the technology as opposed to falling in love with the problem that they are solving for their customer?
Yeah, it's a hard conversation because technology is sexy, right? It's kind of like, it's just hard because technology is far more interesting. You mean process? Process? Boring.
And all the investment you've made in that lightsaber, right?
Exactly, right?
Is it purple? Is it red? Are there two beams out either side? It's so much fun to innovate that, but...
Yeah. And so when it comes to innovating products and services, let's say, for example, we often say to companies that nobody cares about your technology. People only care about the problems they have and how your technology helps them solve those problems. So you're better off understanding the human being before you get to the technology. Not only that, but we have examples of companies with deliberately inferior technology who've beat incumbents. If you take the Nintendo Wii, the Nintendo Wii is deliberately inferior technology, but a really great value proposition, right? People can do things, and they didn't target avid gamers. They just targeted regular folks. And so it's not inevitable that great technology always leads to great value proposition. So we really try and really have that conversation, but it's still a tough conversation to have because there's resistance, especially amongst people that create the technologies themselves. Now, you would think that a company like ours, Strategyzer, who builds a platform where people can go on there, design campuses, run experiments, and said we would lead with that, but we don't. We don't turn up and go, look at our platform. We turn up and first have a conversation about what needs to happen. Because once we have a shared understanding of what needs to happen, then the technology makes sense. Because we designed the technology as an instantiation of a worldview that we have around how teams should work. So until we share that worldview with your company, the technology, we might as well hand you a piece of coal. Like the technology means nothing to you until you can see what we're trying to instantiate through the lens of the technology. And so that's how we really drive those conversations. And we're pretty religiously adamant about that, by the way. Like we don't really bend on that. Like aligning on philosophy, aligning on practice is really important for us we can stop working with you if we can't agree on that. And we're not like turning up and trying to sell our stuff and thinking, oh, you figure it out as long as you pay your subscription. Because in the end, it sort of gives us a bad reputation as an organization. We're really interested in kind of leading the charge of driving this new entrepreneurial movement inside organizations.
Well, and on that topic then, so you're at your third book now, Pirates in the Navy. So tell our listeners a little bit about your book.
Yeah, so Pirates in the Navy was kind of driven by all the mistakes that I made and all the mistakes I saw innovators. Exactly. It's me, like, putting my taboos. You can
capitalize on failure. You can make money on failure. It works.
Exactly. It's me putting all my taboos out in public. And a few of those mistakes, because when you do storytelling around corporate innovation, the antagonist is often the company.
Your client.
The hero is often, no, just for the innovator. So the antagonist, if you're an entrepreneur inside a large organization, you're like, oh, I work with all these MBAs. They don't know what they're doing, etc. So corporate innovators in that story are heroes, and the company is the thing they have to overcome. But in working with corporate innovators, I suddenly realized that sometimes corporate innovators get in their own way. So they get in their own way in terms of the way they tell stories. They get in their own way in terms of how inauthentic they are themselves. They don't really want to launch products. They want to have events and all this other cool stuff, but they're not really genuinely interested in real innovation. They also get in their own way by having like egos about how great they are as innovators. So one of the chapters in my book is You're Not Elon Musk. That's actually the title of the chapter. You're not Elon Musk, and you don't work in a company full of idiots. So all of these things that, corporate entrepreneurs need to do. And one thing I learned, the key takeaway is beyond knowing how to innovate, knowing how to create great value propositions. The number one superpower of the corporate entrepreneur is the ability to create relationships.
The ability to create relationships.
Yes. Yeah. That's the superpower of the intrapreneur. As an entrepreneur running your own startup, you can be as brash as you want, do whatever you want. But if you're going to do innovation inside an established organization, you can't be a pirate. You have to be a pirate in the Navy. Your superpower is political acumen, the ability to bring all the resources you need, to work with legal and compliance, right? To work with finance, to work with all these folks and still be able to stay true to the path of innovation, right? Even while you do that. That balance is really what a corporate entrepreneur needs to have. And so the book really focuses on that skill set and how we can develop that skill set.
It's a level of emotional intelligence, the ability to bring great relationships together. And I'm going to put a plug in for great innovation storytelling that is failure in the service of success.
Yes. Failure in the service. I love that one. Failure in the service of success. Because we've often said failure in the service of learning, but all of us, like every single one of us, even in life in general, we like the failure in the service of success story. We don't like the failure and then you're like an alcoholic in the corner kind of story. Like that's too depressing. It's not inspiring. It doesn't lift us up. And so we do understand this. Like it makes sense. All forms of creativity are failure in the service of success. In the book Originals, Adam Grant talks about this, right? He talks about how we only know 10 or so Mozart pieces, but he wrote 500. We only know 10 or so Shakespeare pieces, but he wrote hundreds. All of that was failure in the service of success, right? We don't say to musicians, write me a number one hit tomorrow. We say, go to studio, work, and then we'll sift through that work and see if there's a hit record in there or a hit song in there once you've done several things. And so we understand this intuitively around creativity, but it's hard in the structure of business where we plan and execute. And so that's what we're trying to break.
So true. So true. And as consumers, we don't even know how to put value on that. We know when we look at a Picasso, there have probably been 5,000 sketches before we got to the masterpiece. Right. But what takes place inside of corporate R&D and development and so forth, that doesn't touch our eyes, and it certainly doesn't touch us necessarily when we hit the shelves. Maybe the $3,000 new VR headset from Apple might convince us that we understand the cost of that innovation. But otherwise, it's hard for us as the consumer to quantify too. Well, exactly. I know we're a little bit short on time and I want to be respectful of yours, and I apologize that I was late today. So, Tendayi, where can people find your all of your books?
Yeah, so the books are on Amazon, wherever you buy books. Pirates in the Navy launched audiobook this week. So you can also now, find it wherever you listen to audiobooks, Audible, etc.
Are you narrating?
No, I'm not. So the publisher got an American founding president to do it.
Oh, this is what got the Stephen Hawking. He's like, why is an American sounding for me? Brit. Criminal.
No, it's okay. It's okay. it's the most surreal thing to hear your words read by somebody else back to you, because I was listening to it the other day. It is the most weird thing, but it's okay. I'm happy with that. And then tendayiviki.com, of course, my website, and strategyzer.com for if you want to work with us to bring some of these practices to your organization.
Yes, absolutely critical to have a technology and a dashboard where you can watch your portfolio bloom and blossom and figure out where you need to put more nutrients in the soil.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely important to be able to look at that. Of course, you first need to have the portfolio, but yeah.
Also helpful. Thank you so much for joining us today on Innovation Storytellers. We're grateful for you, and I will put all the links to your books and your pages on the show site.
Thank you, Susan. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Have a great day.
This innovation story has ended, but yours is just beginning. Go to innovationstorytellers.com, download the free Innovation Storytelling Blueprint, and sign up to pre-order Susan's book, Innovation Storytelling. Get the resources, runway, and recognition you deserve. Due out this spring. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Until the next innovation story.